Thank you. Good morning. This is actually a retread of a talk I've given a few times now. I was invited to speak here on basically any topic of my choice, so this is one that I feel very passionate about. That's why I keep talking about it. And it's about the NON principle, which I think most of you probably heard of. You certainly heard the term. And I feel very, very strongly that this is what made the internet great in the first place. But however, it's under unprecedented threat these days, and I think we need to, when we're fighting fires in the trenches, spam and denial of service act and so forth, I think we need to step back and remember that the reason why we have these problems is because of some principles that made the internet great in the first place, and we need to try to maintain those principles as we solve these problems. This should be a fairly obvious disclaimer. I do work for Qualcomm, but these are my own opinions. I do think that Qualcomm ought to agree with me. Whether or not they do is another story. It is a talk I've given several times before. I noticed every time I'm going over these that actually very little has changed. Just things have gotten kind of worse in the spam department and security department, but really fundamentally nothing has changed at all in a long time. A couple technologies, good technologies like IPv6 and IPsec are a little more widely deployed than before, not as widely deployed as they should be. However, of course, nobody here needs to be told this. A lot of the security problems we have on the net are getting much, much worse. Let me back up and talk about the end-to-end principle for those who are yeah. Oh, sure. Okay. There's a paper that I do believe is the most important paper ever written about computer networking. It's the 1981 paper by Salter, Reed, and Clark that laid out in a very, very cogent fashion just what the end-to-end principle is all about and why computer networks should follow this principle. The one-line summary of this paper is that there are many functions in a computer network that can really only be done properly at the endpoint, on an end-to-end basis, that is, at the edges of the network. Sometimes some of these functions can be justified within the network as a performance enhancement. And the classic example of that is link layer acknowledgments in a radio channel. 802.11 has a link level acknowledgement because if you didn't have one, then the Ethernet semantics of very high reliability packet delivery would not be met, and the system simply wouldn't work that well. But other than that, most of the things are best done on an end-to-end basis, and putting them into lower layers is just unnecessary redundancy. There are a number of these functions that are best done on an end-to-end basis, even if sometimes you may wish to add them in a form to a subnetwork. End-to-end reliability, I just mentioned, is a classic example of that. Security, the only way you can really protect the contents of a customer's traffic is to have the customers do it themselves by protecting the entire path. There are things you can do in lower layers, such as per hop encryption to thwart traffic analysis, which is a kind of a special security problem. But in general, the only way you can really solve this problem is end-to-end. Mobility is another one of these things that I personally believe is much more efficiently done at the end layers. I put this on here in response to a reaction to a lot of the work with mobile IP that, quite frankly, I think is an abuse of the mobile IP model. But if we go back and find out why the internet was designed this way, why did that paper get written? Well, if you go way back to the dark ages now of microprocessors in the 1970s, it's difficult to remember it now, but back in the 1970s, when the microprocessor was brand new, people started to realize then that there was this enormous diseconomy of scale that was appearing with computing. That the smaller the computer, the more efficient it was, and that was a very radical concept. The very notion that a small computer could be more powerful than a big one simply did not occur to most people back in the 1970s. You have to remember how long ago that was. Distributed very rapidly became a buzzword as the best way to take advantage of these diseconomies of scale of processing. And at the time, we had a telephone network, the one communication network of its day. It was very, very monolithic, run by one company. It was very, very complex, quite expensive and inflexible. And it was precisely because the telephone network was designed to be everything that the internet isn't. It was designed to be a quote-unquote intelligent network that would have a lot of function in the network and had terminals that were extremely simple. And way back in the 1970s and 1980s at Bell Labs, where I worked at the time, there was something called the Advanced Intelligent Network, AIN, which nobody here would probably even heard of, but at the time it was an enormous money sink. And it was a total fiasco precisely because the people in the telephone companies did not understand the basic concept of the end-to-end principle and why it was important. Someday, if voice over IP really does, take off, it would be sweet revenge on the telephone network and all those people back in the 1970s who tried to kill the internet when it started. Another very important thing about the end-to-end principle and where it came from was that the people who were building the internet were a very different group of people than those who built the telephone network. The internet architecture was built primarily by those who were actually using it themselves. Okay, and you can't stress too strongly the importance of that principle. The fact that the very same people were building it and designing it and using it. They were sponsored by the DoD, of course, and the DoD was the ultimate customer, but the day-to-day users of this network were the people who were actually designing it. And here I thought a classic quote about open source software from Eric Raymond, I think, is appropriate. That when you're talking about software, the best pieces of software are the ones that were written by some programmer to solve a problem that he himself had. And that was very much the case for the entire internet when it began. I've heard a lot of arguments against the end-to-end principle over the years, and since I've worked in the telephony industry or in the edges of the telephony industry for my entire career, first at Bell Labs, then Delcor, and now Qualcomm, where we work in the cellular industry, I've heard many, many people argue against it, usually on the marketing side. How do we bill for the service? Even today, there's this persistent myth that the internet is somehow free and therefore lives in some kind of economic fantasy world where you can't do anything real with it unless the network takes over and charges you for it all. Even today we hear some people say that. And I've also heard, ever since I got my first computer, a Z80 system with 8-inch floppy disks in my house, people told me, why would anybody ever want to have a computer in their house? And then after that, why would anybody ever want to have a network in their house? And after that, why would anybody want to hook up to the outside network and so forth? I've heard all these excuses, I've been around this long enough now, that I've heard so many people say, we don't need the flexibility of something like the internet. Why do we need to preserve it, this model? We're trying to run a business here. And I think all those arguments have been shown to be bogus over time. There are some very real thoughts to the end-to-end principle, and the main reason I want to talk about this is that sometimes people mean well. They don't really mean as harm, but people are forced to do things that break the end-to-end model, make it difficult to deploy new applications in the way that they were deployed in the early days of the internet. The number one threat here with IPv4 is the address space exhaustion, or more specifically the kludges that people come up with to work around this, like network address translation. That's a long-standing problem that finally shows signs of being solved with IPv6, and I have more to say about IPv6 later. But a much bigger problem in the last several years has really reared its head, and that's pervasive host security problems. If you're going to have every computer on the network, including the computer that your mom owns, able to run internet services all the time, host security suddenly becomes a really important problem or obstacle. And I'm afraid we have Microsoft to thank for that. In reaction to these pervasive host security problems, we have a lot of things that have sprung up in the internet that have done a lot of violence to the end-to-end model, such as packet filters to stop spam being sent out through virus-affected spam relays and so forth and so forth. I've also seen in the research world a lot of threats to the end-to-end model that are, again, well-intended, coming from people who are trying to make the internet work better over some new pipe that I think is so totally different that it needs to modify TCP. The usual place where I see that is either over wireless channels or over satellite channels. I wish I had a nickel for every research paper I've seen in which somebody reinvents the idea of spoofing TCP acknowledgments to make TCP run quote-unquote better over a satellite channel. Or somebody who claims that the internet protocols are just too heavy and too complex to implement on lightweight devices like cell phones. And that led to spectacular fiascos like the wireless access protocol, which derived from an earlier company called Unwired Planet, who is now gone, as far as I know, at least in the original form. So we've had those things, which fortunately over time, time has shown that these approaches are just wrong. We've also seen a gradual layering of new mechanisms over mechanisms that were previously end-to-end. Email is the classic example of this. Originally, back in the good old days, the VAX that you used to send and receive mail was the one that you logged into, and your TCP connections that carried SMTP traffic were really end-to-end. There was no other way to make it. That, of course, changed with the rise of the personal computer and the mail server client model. And so we're now using mechanisms that were originally end-to-end that are no longer have the end-to-end check that TCP provided. It's kind of amazing, actually, that now relays work as well as they do, given that we no longer have this end-to-end mechanism. More in the political side, we have some entities out there who really just don't like the end-to-end model because of the control it gives to the users and takes away from the carriers. We see this with a lot of carriers, especially telephone companies, that started out by simply leasing point-to-point lines to what was originally the Internet, or the ARPANET became the Internet, and then as the Internet became a commercial thing, they started to move up the stack. They now provide routing, which means they control part of the address space, which means they can now do things that they couldn't do before when all they were pipe providers. We have the spectacle of cable modem DSL providers charging for extra IP addresses or for static IP addresses, not because it really costs them anything to do so, but simply because they can. They control the addresses, therefore they're going to charge and they can get away with it. They also like to get into the way of modifying or restricting content. Very often they claim to have good ideas for this, or good reasons for this, such as blocking spam and worms. But they also have some other motives that are a little less than pure, such as trying to insert ads or censoring content from various places they don't like. China, the whole country of China is a classic example of that. We have this horrible thing called a transparent proxy. For some reason, the carriers seem to think that providing raw pipes is not glamorous enough, despite the fact that the industry that they're in is a far larger industry than the content industry. There's a wonderful paper that I have in my references in the back titled "Content is Not King," which I think talks at this point very, very well, that there's actually quite a bit of money to be found in simply selling good internet connectivity, and why everyone is fascinated or feels that they have to get into the content provision business is rather baffling. Unfortunately, the regulators, as usual, don't have a clue on how to properly regulate the carriers, rather than separating wires, which arguably could be managed or regulated as regulated monopolies, from the provision of services that go over those wires. We have the boundary lines in the telephone industry in particular being drawn in the wrong place, which resulted in the pretty much complete collapse of the competitive DSL industry. More recently, we have some even more ominous threats, mostly from the legal direction. We have a lot of the RIAA and MPA types out there talking about peer-to-peer as if it's some new threat, some evil new use of the internet that was never intended, when in fact, of course, the internet was intended to be peer-to-peer. It certainly was in its early days, and only during the internet bubble days did we actually get away from the peer-to-peer model towards this unbalanced client-server, producer-consumer relationship. And now the peer-to-peer network is actually bringing us back full circle to the way the internet was really designed to work. But we have always people out there who don't know that and seem to think that this is some new and terribly antisocial use of the internet. Everyone here knows how serious some of these denial of service attacks are. This kind of stuff is making it very, very difficult to stay true to the end-to-end model. It's being used to justify all sorts of violence to the end-to-end model, such as blocking outbound port 25 to prevent spam and worm relaying. We have one of my pet peeves, the mass dial-up user list blocking, which creates a privileged class of IP addresses that are allowed to send email on their own. We have prohibitions on many carriers impose on running their own servers. Whether or not it generates unacceptable amount of traffic is not the point. They don't want you running servers because it basically takes control of the network away from them. And we have a lot of filters that people are now being forced to go through in their ISP's mail gateways that are supposed to stop spam, but all they end up doing is slowing down legitimate mail. So the real question here, and I think it's pretty obvious, I feel strongly about this, is that the real question is who's in charge of the network, the end user or the carriers? And the end-to-end principle, it was supposed to be the endpoints. The carriers were simply pipe providers. The carriers don't like that, but they really need to be put back in their place, in my opinion. We have some ways of doing this. All is not lost. There are a number of mechanisms available to the end users to defend the end-to-end model. Probably the single most important one is tunneling. IPsec is an especially good way of thwarting any restrictions on content that the carrier may place on you, because they can't discriminate on your content if they can't understand it. If all the packets are opaque to them, then it doesn't matter. But they can't tell whether you're running a server or not, except perhaps by the amount of traffic you generate, which is the one legitimate thing they might might have something to say about. 6-to-4 tunneling is a relatively new form of tunneling that I also think is a very powerful way to get around some of the threats to the NON model. I'll talk more about IPv6 later. There are some features that networks ought to be providing that aren't. Quality of service support in some cases is one of those features. It might be a cleaner way to differentiate service offerings. For example, a carrier might want to provide a higher rate of service, charge more for that, by providing a quality service guarantee. That's I think a perfectly reasonable thing to do, rather than having arbitrary restrictions as you see in many cable modem DSL service offerings. Open source software, that is software that the user controls or can pay someone to do what he wants, is also another very powerful way to defend the end-to-end principle rather than relying on software that you don't control that some carrier provides or forces you to run. IPv6. I've really gotten religion on IPv6 in the last couple of years, particularly because of this one little mechanism called 6-to-4. This is meant as a transition mechanism to allow you to run IPv6 over an IPv4 infrastructure without having to modify the infrastructure. I personally have found it to be extremely useful as a way of getting around the limitations of NAT boxes when I have several servers at home and I want to be able to get into them remotely, and I want to be able to establish direct TCP connections whether I'm sending UDP packets to them without having to set up a port forwarding hack on a NAT box or log into one machine and log in and hop from there. It's already the case that most operating systems on the market are dual stack. All the major operating systems, current versions, all support IPv6 and seem to do it very nicely. Windows XP, Linux, Mac OS X all support IPv6. The way I see things going is I think we're going to end up with dual stack hosts for a very long time. IPv4 is not going away anytime soon, but you know, it works just fine for the things we've always used it for web surfing, for sending and receiving email from a client. IPv4 works just fine. Where IPv6 is really going to become very useful is in reestablishing the peer-to-peer model of the internet and in running new applications such as voice over IP without excessive reliance on central servers. There's this persistent myth about IPv6, and I encountered this a lot at work. Since I work for Qualcomm, which is a company that makes very large numbers of cell phone chips, and we want to get internet services, IPv6 is something that's obviously very important to us because it's in fact as an enabling technology. We can't do what we want to do without it. But there seems to be this pervasive belief around work that people I talk to that IPv6 is in a catch-22 situation, and we can't use it until the carriers support it. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth. With 6-to-4 tunneling, you can use it right now. Only the endpoints have to support it. That's the whole idea behind tunneling. And most of the operating systems already have it. So why don't we just turn it on and start using it? And personally, I actually kind of like that my carriers don't do IPv6 natively right now, because when they do, they'll start doing all the things to IPv6 packets that they now do to IPv4, and I'd like to wait before they do that. So the question is, will IPv6 succeed? I think a lot of it boils down to whether or not the users or or someone else controls the v6 address space. There's already some complaints about how hard it is to get v6 address blocks. However, IPv6 6-to-4 tunneling works around that in a very practical way by giving an implicit assignment to anyone who has even a single IPv4 address that is globally routable. It's not how the RFC 1918 block. It does require upgrades, but most of the important upgrades are already out there. What I'm waiting for right now is for the consumer-grade boxes, the D-Links, the Netgears, those things to implement 6-to-4 tunnels alongside NAT. I don't know of any that does right now, but I can't wait until they do. I think that will really cause v6 to take off. It will, however, worsen host security problems. A while back, I had the opportunity to listen to some people from Microsoft talk about their v6 plans, and their plans were all around reestablishing the peer-to-peer model and running new applications on an end-to-end basis to home networks, which is all well and good until you consider the state of the security of their software, and you realize that this is going to cause some real problems unless their host security gets a lot better very quickly. So I do think, the more I think about it, and the more I watch what's going on, the security threat is probably right now the single biggest threat to the continued existence of the end-to-end model. We have many different problems that are being attacked. We have different resources that are being attacked, the eyeballs of the user or the network or the host computer. And I think it is right now the single biggest threat to the end-to-end model, simply because it's proving so difficult to fix. I've been spending a lot of time in security over the last 10 years. I got into the field not because I really like security, but because I feel like it has to be solved, or somebody else is going to solve in a way that I don't like. So I better get in there and try to solve it the way I think it should be solved. I see many people coming up with security or alleged security fixes that are anything but. Because they really aren't thinking about what the threats are and the best way to meet those threats without sacrificing the utility of the network. To this end, there is something I like to call the security placement principle, which is the notion that security mechanisms ought to be placed as close as possible to whatever it is you're protecting, which means you have to distinguish between these different kinds of attacks and what it is they're attacking. If you have an attack that is trying to take down someone's network link, that's a very different kind of attack than someone that is trying to break into a computer and read confidential data. Host attacks can only be prevented by mechanisms that are in the host, properly, that is. Some people claim to be able to do it with a network. And network attacks can only be prevented by mechanisms built into the network. Personally, I believe that humans are more valuable than machines. As far as spam blocking is concerned, I really don't care how many cycles or spam uses up on my computer, or even how much disk space it uses. What matters to me is whether I have to waste my time reading it. Humans are considerably more valuable than machines. That means I don't mind spending machine time if necessary to save my time and having to deal with it, as long as the users are still in control of whatever mechanisms are implemented in these machines. This has been one of the problems we've had so far with a lot of the ad hoc ISP mechanisms for dealing with spam and denial of service attacks. I have a little rant here about Microsoft. I think most of you probably have seen some of this stuff before. You certainly have seen anybody who's looked at traffic statistics knows what a typical worm does to a mail server. This is my own mail server as of last August. Now, since then we've had yet another round of worms. We got MyDoom, which is, as far as I can tell, just as bad on my mail server as this one. But this was last August. These numbers are hourly rates showing the number of messages rejected to just my email address. Because it's so big.f, and the numbers peak out at 20,000 an hour back in August. Okay, this can't go on. This is happening with disturbing regularity, and if this kind of stuff can't be solved, we can kiss the end-to-end model goodbye. In my own world, I'm worried much more not so much about spam, but for what it will do to the user's eyeballs, but what it will do in the cellular network to a very limited channel resource. We have cellular networks that are operating already very, very close to the physical limits of what those channels are capable of doing, using spectrum that's rather expensive, and that makes a denial of service attack a disturbingly easy thing to do in a cellular network. If we can't solve the denial of service problem in the cellular network, we simply can't deploy the kinds of end-to-end peer-to-peer services that we would like to deploy. So in order to do that, we have to build filters in the network that have to be intelligent filters. I think that we need to work both on a long-term and a short-term fix to the problem of denial of service attacks. We need a general solution, but that's not something we're going to get overnight. But we're going to need it in the long run if we are going to restore the end-to-end model. Let's go over spam. I think most people know what Bayesian filters are. And conclude by saying that if we can't solve the security problem, we're never going to get the end-to-end model back. We will still need filtering to protect the network. Even if host security is a solved problem, we still have the problem of how to protect the network itself against denial of service attacks. Quality service mechanisms may provide some protection against denial of service attacks as sort of an inherent benefit, but we can't count on that. I think we need to build some mechanisms that are specifically designed to be deployed within the network that can deal with the denial of service attack problem. We have to do it in a more automated and efficient way than calling up in the network operators on the phone and manually typing in filters into a router firewall. And there need to be standard ways of doing this. There need to be ways that end users can access and control without having to call up an operator on the phone. So that's it, and I have a couple of references here. These are what I think of as relevant documents, particularly the end-to-end argument paper, which is, I still think, like I said before, I think is the most important peer networking paper ever written. And this one is one I've only found actually fairly recently. I think is an excellent one that talks about, or may give you some idea of where the carriers are coming from that are trying to break the NANOG model because they feel that they don't want to be selling their glorified pipes. And this is a very good paper to use in response to show that you can actually make quite a bit of money selling nothing but simple transparent pipes. So that's it, and I'll pass it back to Sue. Thank you.